Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. This last week in our Profiler Training Facebook group, so we have a special Facebook group for the people who go through a Profiler Training certification course every year. And in the Facebook group, there was a really interesting question that emerged from one of our students, asking for resources as somebody who's learning profiling, which is effectively having a conversation with another person and being able to help them determine their best fit type through a conversation that allows their mind's wiring to unfold. So it's a little bit more of a sophisticated technique than just taking an online test and with forced choice questions and sort of hoping that the mood that you're presenting that day is more authentic to you than the mood you were presenting the day before. So there's a little bit of sort of natural coaching that always ends up getting folded into these profiling sessions, because once you walk somebody through these sessions and you help them locate their best fit type, which is the Myers-Briggs personality type that feels the best to them or the most authentic to them, then usually they almost always ask the question, well, what do I do with this? And so in Profiler Training, while it's technically not intended to be a coaching program, students almost always pick up coaching skills because that's usually what people are looking for, is practical application to this information now. And so one of our students was asking, well, what happens when a person discovers their type and learns that there are things that are stereotypical to their personality type that run contradictory with how they feel about themselves, maybe based on past experiences, maybe based on the things that influence them throughout their life that go contradictory to the stereotypes around their dichotomies or maybe even their cognitive functions. And should the encouragement be that they reject these elements of their personality that have emerged through influences throughout their life, even if it's working for them, that go contradictory to how they're quote unquote supposed to be wired? Do you say, well, keep those behaviors even though they run, contrary to arguably how you're supposed to be, operating the best? Or do you say, no, embrace your new type and all the things that are supposed to come along with it and reject some of those behaviors even if they've been working for you? So that's a bit of an abstract way of looking at it, but let's get a specific example to sort of clarify this. So let's say somebody discovers that they are a perceiver in the Myers-Briggs system, and that feels good to them. They've had their cognitive functions described to them. They're really resonating with their car model and everything's feeling good. But then they get to an explanation that perceivers, even though this is a gross oversimplification, but let's pretend that the person explains to them that as a perceiver, they're going to have less of a crucial relationship to time. Or they go online and read all of these stereotypes or archetypical descriptions of their personality type as a perceiver, and they discover that people like them are usually late, right? And that's like a common sort of behavior that ends up being associated with perceivers. And they go, well, I'm never late. I'm always on time. And the conversation unfolds, well, I grew up in a family where being on time was incredibly important. And now I actually have maybe some trauma around being late, because when I was a kid, if I was late, then I would get punished, or it was a big deal. And it definitely was not acceptable to be late. So now I have some of these, I have a stress or anxiety that comes up over it, but I make sure I am never late. In a situation like that, do you say, well, as a perceiver, of course you're going to have trauma around that because that's not going to be your natural style. So you should just sort of reject all the trauma that came up for you being late, and you should embrace your more freeform nature. And as a perceiver, you can just tell people, well, being on time is not my bag and it's no big deal, and sort of embrace this new, understanding of how you function. Or do you say, yeah, no, being on time is legitimately a good behavior set, and the world will reward you for it. So you want to be on time if at all possible. So go ahead and keep the trauma that might be associated with it because it's working for you, and disregard these descriptions of being a perceiver and just embrace that you're the kind of person who, regardless of your personality type, has determined that being on time is super important. So what do you do? Do you recommend people embrace this new understanding of themselves, even if helpful strategies are now going to be lost in or rejected in an attempt to be more in alignment with how they're cognitively wired? Or do you suggest or recommend that they just ignore those components of their wiring and maintain the strategy because the strategy has been working for them.
I look at this like a good example would be something maybe you've done around your home. Let's say you own a house and you have a certain way that the homeowners before you put drainage systems in around your house. So when it rains, like the gutter systems, for example, the water hits the roof, it rolls down in the gutter systems, it takes it down a spout, and it shoots it out so away from the house so the house doesn't have water damage along the side of it, damaging the house. And it's working. It's kind of like, it's moving the water away, but it's causing these puddles around the house. Like the house foundation's fine, but there's puddles I keep stepping in. So do we make the house the way it should have been set up from the beginning? We set the gutters up and we run these spouts down and we shoot them way away from the house to get them away from the house. So there's no puddles and it's not damaging the foundation. Or do we just keep living with the puddles around the edge of the house that the spouts are causing based on how it was set up before? I mean, it's working. There's no foundational problems. The roof water gets pushed off from the house. And I think the desire is to have both. Desire is initially to say, well, I don't want to have the damage around the foundation of the house, but I also don't like these puddles. So I want both. But the challenge here is you're going to have to go and rip out the old way it was done and reinstall a new way. And in the midst of that, you're going to have tons of puddle and tons of water at the foundational level. So in the fixing period, this is just kind of how I'm looking at it, you're going to remove what has been there. So you're going to cause, it's actually going to be worse than it ever was before. You're going to have the water not pushing away from the house or away from the foundation. So the puddles are going to be there, they're going to build up, and it's going to get wet down around the foundation. So now you've got both problems when you're trying to rewire this. And the question really becomes, as far as I'm concerned in this, the question is a matter of timing. Can I do the work fast enough to reconnect strategies that have worked for me in the past with a new way of doing them before my life falls apart? So this is a very personal example for me. For example, like I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system. We talk about the CAR model. If you don't know what that's about and you're a new listener, go look up the CAR model on our website. You're going to find a bunch of great information from that. But in the CAR models in ENFP, I have a driver of exploration, extroverted intuition. My Copilot is introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity. And my 10-year-old is what we've nicknamed effectiveness, extroverted thinking. As an ENFP, I have a tendency to get an extroverted loop. I go to my exploration. When I do decisions, I tend to go to my 10-year-old process, my tertiary process of extroverted thinking or effectiveness. And I say, what will work in this situation? What will get the job done? And I've developed a lot of strategies over my life, decades of strategies to accomplish tasks. One of those things that I rely upon is an emotion of anxiety to get things done. And in the last year or two, I've been trying to rewire myself. I know at the core of my being that anxiety will produce an outcome. If I have a project to do, if I can create anxiety in my heart or my mind, that project will get done. I anchor that in my effectiveness 10-year-old, and I will get that project accomplished. But if I remove the strategy of feeling anxious, if I remove that ability from my 10-year-old effectiveness process, it no longer has the strategy to fall back on of anxiety. Well, now I don't have the assurance I can get a project done. I'm not exactly sure. I know that probably if I pulled upon excitement, the emotion of excitement or passion, or some type of a positive energy, that would probably work. But I don't know how to find that as fast as I can find anxiety. So now I've got projects in front of me with no strategies that I've relied upon in the past that I'm allowing myself to access. And it's as if I ripped out the gutter system on my house and the water's just running down. It's creating puddles and it's going down around the foundation. And I kind of feel now I have like some legit anxiety. Like, do I have enough time to rewire this before it all goes to crap? So I think that's the challenge here is the ability to rewire yourself fast enough or completely enough to make up for the deficiencies that you will have when you let go of some of these original strategies.
Yeah, because I think, when we talk about, if you're going to pare Personality Hacker down into one soundbite, I would say the soundbite is develop your Copilot. And we talk about it all the time. Develop your Copilot, develop your Copilot. And when we talk about the 10-year-old function being at approximately 10 years old, we actually get a lot of pushback from people. In fact, I know quite a few people who resist that idea and actively say there's no way. We have much more sophisticated 10-year-old tertiary processes. The technical name is tertiary. It's more like a teenager or maybe even somebody in their 20s. And I don't know if I've met anybody who will acknowledge that their tertiary function isn't as sophisticated as at least a teenager, if not, and not more aged. And I think one of the reasons why is because we have so many strategies that live in our tertiary function that we feel like if we let go of them, then we're not sure how we're going to be able to cope. And so I think we project onto that tertiary function a maturity that it doesn't have simply because we're leaning on it so hard. And then when we look at the prospect of letting go of those strategies in our tertiary function, and we more focus on the auxiliary, we recognize how, just like any time, like you mentioned, that you have to unearth something or you have to rebuild a structure, that the mess is actually going to make it look incredibly regressive. In some ways, it almost makes it appear as if the tertiary is more sophisticated than the auxiliary or the Copilot function. And so people will resist the idea that their tertiary isn't something that they should be leaning so heavily on because they are already doing so. And they have so many strategies there. And when they start to pursue that auxiliary or Copilot development, their whole life looks like it's being ripped up. And from an outsider's perspective, if you were just coming along and walking by, a house that was getting its foundation restructured and you saw all of this stuff ripped up, but you didn't have any context that this was like you didn't know what it looked like before, you didn't know why they were doing the remodeling they're doing, and you didn't know what the end result was intended to be. And it took a while, maybe longer than the anticipation is. The person walking by could make a lot of judgments about that home. Like, that home is trashy, or it's just all ripped up, or maybe they don't know what they're doing, or get it together, guys, get this done faster. And so being on the receiving end of people observing your progress can make it appear as if you're regressive to other people, and it will feel regressive to you getting that feedback. And so then people rush back to their 10-year-old. They rush back to their tertiary and go, no, my tertiary is fine. It gets the job done. I know it's way more sophisticated than a 10-year-old. I know that one for a fact. and it's because we have to believe that. We have to, because we're so over-reliant on it.
Yeah, I would say don't mistake dependency for proficiency. Just because you're dependent on something doesn't mean it's proficient, doesn't mean it's necessarily completely mature or optimized to its nth degree. It just means you're dependent on it. And so dependency makes it feel like something's way more important. I mean, you know this, if you've ever been in a relationship and you felt dependent on that person and you're like, I can't live my life without that person, and then that person's no longer in your life, are you able to live your life? Most people are, right? It's not like, but you were dependent on that person or that entity in some way to a degree where you thought it inflated its importance, but it's not necessarily proficient. It's just dependent.
Yeah, well, and you're going to defend them if somebody gives them criticism.
Yeah.
Like if you're dependent on another person and somebody goes, they're not that good at whatever it is you think they're that good at, you're going to defend them because you're going to defend your dependency upon them. And you're not going to want to think, I hitched my wagon to a lame horse. Like you want to think that you chose well in whichever wagon you hitched yourself to, or whatever horse you hitched your wagon to. So I think going back to the original question of, okay, so I discover my personality type. I realize that I've built strategies that once I look at my cognitive function or my car model, my function stack, that I've realized that I'm actually doing a lot of behaviors that are living in functions that might not be my two strengths. Like take, for example, I'm a perceiver and I've got to be on time because I have a lot of trauma around it from my childhood. And so like let's pretend I'm saying that as an ENTP. And I realized as an ENTP, my 10-year-old or tertiary function of extroverted feeling or harmony has all this trauma around societal expectations of what it means if I'm late. And so I feel bad about that. Like I feel like other people are going to be judging me. So I've got all this anxiety and trauma in my 10-year-old or tertiary function, and that's what's keeping me quote unquote honest. That's what's keeping me on time. But if I start to look at this function stack and I go, well, actually my growth path is not to continue to, care what the societal expectations are of me. My growth path is actually get away from that and determine what makes sense to me as an individual using my introverted thinking or accuracy. For a time, until I know what means something to me with this whole timing thing, I might be perpetually late. And if I'm perpetually late, that's going to be a major problem for me. Like, I mean, who cares if I'm late to a party, but what if I'm late to work all the time? Or what if I'm late to church? Or what if I'm late to these things that are actually meaningful? And I'll get these judgments come down hard on me and I'll feel even worse about it. So should I just go ahead and go, you know what, even though I'm an ENTP, I still feel like it's super important to be on time, and my strategy for being on time is to absorb all the fear of the societal judgment I'll get if I'm late, and allow that judgment to weigh on me and to control some of my behaviors, because it is actually assisting in a behavior that I think is overall good for me. And I think that that's a very relevant question. I think that's a good question. What happens when you lose the strategies that live in earlier functions, when those functions are also attached to negative traits like trauma or anxiety?
I think the challenging thing here, going back to the metaphor that we've been kind of using, this idea of like refabbing a house, right? I use the metaphor of the gutter system, the drainage on the roof. You talked about redoing the foundation. But either one, you're ripping up an entity and you're working on it. And one of the things that I think, kind of building on this metaphor of construction, the one thing about when we're doing personal growth that's challenging is we can't take ourselves into the laboratory or the workshop offline. Like we're still online while we're doing the work. We're kind of like a road construction crew. You got to still let traffic go through as you're still ripping up the road, right? And so it's really difficult. This is one of the challenges with personal growth, just in general, is that when you're doing work like this, you have to do it while you still operate your life in a lot of ways. So this question becomes very poignant in, okay, if I'm going to rewire something about myself, I'm going to grow my Copilot. That means I've got to start letting go of my 10-year-old. And like Antonia talked about, we have so many strategies that live there, but we can't just take ourselves on offline and like work on this and then come and connect back into humanity. Like we still have to get up in the morning, go to work, take care of kids, deal with our partner or lover or spouse. Like friends and family are still going to call around the holidays. Like we can't just go away while this happens unless you have like really extreme circumstances for something like that. But most of us have to do the work while we're still in the flow of actual life. So this question becomes very important because it's the question of how do I balance working on myself and pushing the envelope of rewiring stuff while I still need to get things done or interface with other humans in the same way that I have in the past, and not let that atrophy away. So I still need to be able to engage, but I haven't hooked up the new stuff yet to engage with the new way of doing it. I'm still relying on these old strategies living in my 10-year-old, my tertiary process. So the question becomes a question of timing. How do I do this on a timeline that makes sense? It's fast enough that I can continue moving with my life and everything doesn't fall apart around me. I think that's very personal for me. I mean, I ask myself that same question all the time. How do I get more into my introverted feeling, authenticity Copilot, and not lose the strategies in my effectiveness or 10-year-old of getting things done? Because I've got a business to run. I've got kids to raise. I've got stuff to do, right? But as I'm reconnecting that introverted feeling, I'm noticing I'm not as proficient with having things happen in the outside world using it. And time is running out for me to continue working on that sometimes. So that's really, I think it's a question of timing often.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple other components that come in this alongside of timing. I think the first thing that comes up for me is ROI, which I think it was ultimately the question that was being asked by our student, which is, what's the return on investment? Do I embrace my type and all the components of it and all these elements that I'm understanding are more native to my wiring if I'm losing these things that have served me well? Or do I just take whatever hit is associated with the things that are serving me, even if they're not native to me? And I think when we've been living in those strategies for so long, we forget exactly what that hit is. Like the hit isn't just that we're not exactly behaving the way that would have been maybe, if we had been able to sort of craft our childhood experience in, like off the shelf, like I'd like to be a hippie and I'd like to live out in the nature and I'd like to have been raised by people who, taught me, like the world by traveling or whatever. Like we didn't get to choose our childhood. And so then we integrate these influences in our life that change maybe how we would have gone about things had we been able to, choose our experience more to tailoring to us. And because we've been out of our native wiring for so long, we almost forget what hit we're taking. We only see the results because the results were the piece that was getting either rewarded or punished. Again, an easy expression of this is perceivers and being late. If your natural native wiring was to have a more casual relationship with time, then the outside world is going to either punish you for not synchronizing your swatches, or it was going to reward you for getting maybe amped up and making sure you were on time. And even if that meant that you had to do it through anxiety or trauma. So the hit of anxiety, the hit of coming along with all this trauma, is something that you've been dealing with for so long. It's like it's the devil you know. You almost don't experience it anymore, even though in the moment it's probably very unpleasant. It's the devil you know, and you've acclimated to it, and you don't get punished, which is oftentimes way worse when you're a kid, getting punished by outside feedback. So you just take that anxiety and you go, yeah, but the result is that I'm on time and I don't have all of those like icky feelings like I'm a bad person. And so there's not really that much of a hit. It's just an in the moment, like, oh, okay, I gotta be there on time, and okay, and so I gotta get all the kids together, and now I'm yelling at them, and now we're all in the car, and now we're going, and everybody's like, why are you rushing me? And it's okay because we're on time and we're there, and oh, we're even a couple minutes early. Okay, whew. And then everybody calms down and chills out and goes on with their day. When the alternative is, what if you never had to feel that ever again? You just never had to go through a situation where you were super anxious and yelling at your family to get someplace, and you had that like 10-minute spike of everybody freaking out to make sure everybody's in the car and on their way to whatever appointment, and you just never had to feel that again. But sometimes you're going to be a little late. That does not feel like good ROI to most people. Like that does not feel like a good, healthy trade-off, because the imprint has already been inculcated into their wiring that being late is the worst thing, which is why they're willing to take the hit of that anxiety in that moment anyway. So when you're encouraging people to embrace their native wiring and you say, yeah, well, for a time, you're probably going to do all the stuff that your imprints told you was the worst thing ever, which is why you don't do those things, and you've gone to your 10-year-old or your tertiary for strategies, you're going to have to take those as a hit for a while. And I know your brain has decided that those are all the worst things ever, but, eventually at the end of the road, there's this really positive thing where you don't have to feel anxiety ever again. And the person probably goes, I mean, I can totally see somebody going like, well, why is that a thing? Why would I even make that choice? Of course I'm going to stick with the 10 minutes of anxiety and obey the early imprint that is incredibly important to be on time, as opposed to spend all of this time and effort rerouting all of these thoughts into, in my case as an ENTP, into introverted thinking or accuracy, where I may or may not be on time. I may or may not get all this terrible feedback from the world. And I don't really see an upside. Like, what's the point of that? So before you even go to a timing question of when do I start this process, I have to be convinced that this process is even worth it to begin with. And then I think if there is something that is persuasive about development and growth, and I'd like to touch on that in just a moment, what the actual return on investment is. But if you do become persuaded, and now you got to figure out your timing, you also have to have faith in yourself that at the end of the process, you'll have what it takes to get through these early imprints. You'll have what it takes to get through all of this weird wiring and rerouting traffic, quote unquote, and that at the end of it, the person who you are natively, like how you're natively wired, and the person that you'll become doing all of this work will have been worth it on the other side too. Like you are actually a good person that doesn't require maybe all of this, social imprinting or all this imprinting on the outside world, that whoever you naturally are is a really solid human being that will be able to navigate all of this stuff on your own. And that person is worth meeting on the other side. So you've got, is this worth it at all to lose these imprints that are very important to me? What is the timing? When am I going to start interjecting this work that will be disruptive to my life? And will the person on the other side even be worth all the work that I've done?
Yeah. So both of us are ENPs. Let me just pull another example in here to get a sense of what we're talking about for you listening. We have an ENTJ friend who right now is working on his Copilot of introverted intuition. We've nicknamed it perspectives. His 10-year-old in the car model as an ENTJ would be extroverted sensing or sensation. And the loop for him then would be extroverted thinking or effectiveness is his driver. He's in an extroverted attitude. And then he skips the Copilot and he uses his extroverted sensing or sensation at the 10-year-old level to see what's going on in the world. So as he's perceiving his world, it's very quick. It's in the moment. He often is very zoomed in on the tangible aspect of what's happening in the moment. And we've noticed he actually has had some frustration as he's been working on his introverted intuition, his Copilot. He's starting to lose touch with some of the in-the-moment details of his life, and it's freaking him out. Like he's in conversations, he's a little more introverted. He's not as outgoing or people-focused as he once was. And he's starting to not notice as many tangible details in the moment. He's more in his head. He's kind of daydreaming a little bit more. He's starting to question if he's got social acumen anymore. Like, do I have what it takes in a social situation to keep a conversation going, to be interesting, to get this person to like me? Like, he's articulating to us that he's a little concerned like he might be losing this skill set as he lets go of his tertiary 10-year-old extroverted sensation process, right? And it's kind of this, we had this conversation about this. Like, it's unnerving, isn't it? You feel like, oh my gosh, like, am I going to lose all my ability to do what I've done up till now? Some of these things that have served me very well. And I'm just throwing another example out there because I don't think it's just the two of us, which we have, extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling as our 10-year-olds, Antonia and myself. It's also going to happen with perceiving processes too.
Well, and he also feels like he might be losing some of his industriousness.
Yeah.
Because he's always been go, go, go. And now that he's getting into his Copilot of introverted intuition or perspectives, he's having to learn patience.
A lot less is getting done.
Yeah, less is getting done. It's not happening as quickly. And he's having to sort of lean back as opposed to constantly being in the fray. And so the fear is not only does he feel like he's losing maybe some social acumen, but also he's losing some value because a big piece of his value proposition was this industriousness where he was always, go, go, go. And so in some ways it feels like this is not worth it at all. Like what is the point of this? What I get to see longer timelines and get inside other people's perspectives. It just means that I'm not getting as much done in the moment and that other people might not like me. And I didn't even know that before. It's almost like ignorance is bliss in that way.
Yeah.
And I think when it comes to, like take for another example, like maybe ISPs, getting into the moment as opposed to being in their 10-year-old of introverted intuition or perspectives, it makes them feel like they're losing their edge too, because now they're not now they're losing their ability to stay ahead of the game or stay one step ahead of other people. And now it's forcing them to be more expressive and make themselves more vulnerable to outside opinion and other people's feedback. Like they're now putting themselves in the crosshairs and exposing how they're actually feeling or thinking. And they're not able to sort of outwit other people by staying ahead of them, by being inscrutable. Every single personality type has a version of the fear of what they'll lose if they get out of that 10-year-old or tertiary. And so because of that, it makes it very difficult to persuade people to, number one, get an accurate, modest assessment of exactly where their 10-year-old or tertiary function is at in development. Because as we mentioned, just because you're dependent on it is not a sign of its proficiency. It just means you're dependent on it. And because it's hard for us to see that with any clarity, it means that when we suggest people get out of it, they're very grabby. They're very attached to the strategies that live there. And then persuading them that the ROI is actually getting into this other function that for a time will appear regressive to others or even to themselves can be a hard sell. It can be a very hard sell.
I think it is not an appearance. I think I fully, at this point, have come around to say, at least in my life, it is regressive. It's like that metaphor we talked about at the beginning, where you're redoing the gutters on your house. You have to rip off the old ones. And while that's happening, the rainwater is not going to be captured. It's going to fall all over the place. It's going to be a mess. It's not going to be efficient. And it's not going to work well at all. Like it's going to be really difficult and challenging, and it's going to be all dismantled, discombobulated all over the place. This is how I see it. And I don't think there's a way to preserve what is currently with what you want to become as a person. You have to give up to get up, or you have to give up to go up, I guess, in a lot of ways. That's how I see it. Like you've got to give up some of the ways you've done things in order to reconnect new ways. In the middle of that's a construction zone. It's going to be torn apart. Anytime you've been in a house that's being remodeled or a road system that's being constructed, it's a disaster. There's dust and dirt and equipment, and it looks horrible, and it doesn't function well, and it's a bloody mess. However, again, it comes down to timing. Can you do the work? This is why I believe in fast personal growth, is if I'm going to rip it all up, I might as well do the work and get through it fast. Otherwise, I leave things in shambles. And so I think in all of this, the biggest thing I would recommend for you listening is get to work if you're going to start this process. Don't just let this languish for years and years and years. Get to stepping, because the faster you can reconnect it, the faster you can get back on your track in a lot of ways.
And going back to that, what is the actual ROI? Why would I be persuaded to even do this? The answer comes from what you said before, which is when you see the way that the homeowner did it before, and you see the way that you would have wanted to have done it from the beginning, and you try to reconcile those two things. What is it that you actually want? And you said the answer is both. Well, that's actually what you get. When you do Copilot development, actual legit auxiliary Copilot development, the end of all of it is you get both. You get all of the capacities, meaning that, take, for example, as a perceiver, let's say as an ENTP, I'm just going to use again my type as an example. If I was on time, I actually never integrated that whole I have to be on time, otherwise everybody hates me thing. But I know other perceivers have, and other perceivers have integrated the importance of being on time in their introverted judging function of either introverted feeling or authenticity or introverted thinking and accuracy. And I know that when it lives in their 10-year-old or tertiary function as anxiety, and they feel like they have to be on time or people will be judging them, when you start kicking that decision-making up to introverted thinking or accuracy, the challenge is not having enough faith in yourself to know that you're going to come to a good conclusion on the importance of time. Because it's not as if the accuracy or introverted thinking function has zero relationship with time. And it's not like it doesn't have any relationship with other human beings. It's just not leaning so heavily on other people's judgment to create motivation. It's self-motivated. And the same thing with introverted feeling or authenticity. It's self-motivated. That's its purpose, is to create a subjective motivation structure as opposed to an external motivation structure. So you become intrinsically wired to behave the way that you want to behave. And introverted thinking or accuracy may come to the conclusion that it's not always important to be on time. Like, that might not make sense to it. But it would be hard to logic your way through living in the day-to-day world that never being on time is equally reasonable or rational. Like, it's irrational to think that you will never have to be on time. So when leaning upon this new function of introverted thinking or accuracy, what you're doing is you're allowing it to sort of sit with the question of how reasonable is my relationship with time? How much am I supposed to care about this? What's the logical position? What is a systemic way of looking at it? And of course, your introverted thinking or accuracy function will vary with its answers because it's subjective to you. Mine has come to the conclusion that if anything is relying on me in order to have something happen, or if other people are relying on me, it's my responsibility to be there on time. But if a situation is not relying on me at all, right? Like I'm just showing up to a party or I'm just showing up to an event that's somebody else's thing, then I don't really care that much. If I'm late, I'm late. If I'm not, I'm not. It's just whatever time I was able to get there. So that's what makes the most sense to me. And I trust that part of me. I trust that that's not a bad conclusion to come from, to come at on this whole, like, whether or not I'm going to be there on time. And because it's mine, I don't feel any anxiety around it. I just feel a sense of focus. So I'm able to, say, run retreats or run live events or run online virtual events and be there on time as a general rule. Now, if something isn't reliant on me and I'm not there, I don't have to feel any sort of anxiety or judgment from others. If they're judging me, that's not really my problem. And so what I get is I get an internal motivation that is not associated with stress or anxiety, that is an intrinsic sort of fire inside of me to ensure that I show up to the things that are important to me. And I got to control that. I got to decide that for myself. I didn't outsource it to anybody else. So I get the feeling of autonomy that as an ENTP is very important to me. I get to be on time to most things that are important to me and to other people. And I get to not care if somebody judges me for not being on time because that wasn't important to me to begin with. So why would I outsource my self-esteem to another person who has a different value system than I do? And so I get both. That's the nice thing, is that at the end of all of this, I get both. I get to both be on time, and I also get to not care about other people's opinions of me. And I think that's the persuasive piece, is that if you can actually get through the construction zone, if you can get through that time period of everything being like all the foundation being ripped up and all the rerouting happening and all the like the struggle of having to orchestrate all of this, at the end of it, you get to have both. You get to have the things that mean something to you, and you get to have your autonomy and your self-mastery. But it does take time. And it's sometimes hard to see that coming down the road when you've been reliant so hard on these other strategies to get you to where you want to go.
I think though, again, going back to it, I think that having that construction mindset, hey, it's going to be ripped up a while. I know it's not going to be perfect right now. It's a laboratory I'm in. I'm trying to work on something. And even in your own mind, you could tell other people, I guess, in your life about this. But in your own mind, just having that in the back of your head, like, yeah, I'm a work in progress right now. I'm doing a major reconstruction process on my personality, on my psyche, on my personal growth journey. And it's going to be messy, and just be okay with that. That's kind of in a similar vein. So mine's not been around the time issue. Mine's been a lot about motivation, getting things done. As an ENFP, I've really relied upon my 10-year-old of effectiveness to run a business, to build products, to build services, to get things checked off my to-do list. And I've used, emotions like anxiety or nervousness or intensity to drive myself forward. Those are the motivations I've gone to. I've anchored those in my extroverted thinking or effectiveness. When I need them, I pull them off a shelf, almost like a tool. And I'm trying to rewire my emotions. I'm trying to have things that are deeply resonant, get into that introverted feeling authenticity process, and pull upon the things that excite me, that are passionate, that are joyful. And that's sometimes tough because, a daily task may not be passionate, joyful. So I've got to figure out like complex ways to connect something on a meta level, something like the impact I have with people at a live event in 6 months from now. I have to almost imagine that feeling I'm going to have there, the passion, the excitement, the connection, the impact, and then back it up and wire it down to editing this podcast after it's over. I guess I could get more direct with it. This podcast, get excited about you listening to it, and the impact and the conversation we'll have with it. But maybe there's something else, like, a basic to-do item, send this email off of this technical thing for the back end of a website somewhere. I have to think in terms of how does this play into a bigger passion, a bigger picture, something that juices me up rather than just pulling upon some of those old techniques and those old wirings. It doesn't mean those are gone. Those are still there. And I have to kind of balance this issue. So I see it almost like a construction zone that I'm in the middle of. And it's tough. I mean, one of the things that's happened for me as an ENFP, getting into my introverted feeling or authenticity process as a Copilot, is basic things like I'm losing things. I'm misplacing my keys and my to-do lists and other things that I've usually been really good at tracking. I'm in what's resonating with me and how I'm feeling in the moment way more. And so I'm not tracking the extroverted thinking aspects of my life. And so and then I have to struggle with the frustrations that come from that, right? All the emotions that hit me from, wow, where did my keys go? Damn it, if I only followed my system, I wouldn't have lost my keys, but I let my system go because I didn't feel about a system in the moment. I was feeling through my day. And now I've got to figure another way to cope with these other emotions that are coming in because of the deficiency that I didn't have, being able to track my keys or something like this. So this is not an easy process. I think it's extremely difficult. But to Antonia's point, if you focus on this, it's been my experience and the experience of people that we've worked with here at Personality Hacker, clients, people we've coached, friends of ours, other people who've drank the Kool-Aid, if you will, that have done this work. The feedback has been from all of them and myself, my own personal experience, that it does get better. It's still a challenge for me. It's still something I'm working on. But my God, it's been so much better in the last year than it was 2 years ago when I was starting to work on this. So it does get better. You get more proficient. Over time, you build skill. And I think one of the things that if I had to go back and redo it over again, I would focus on it faster. Because what happens is you get in that Copilot and you're like, this is throwing me out of my frame. I don't know if I can handle this. I gotta back off the pedal. I'm losing track, or I can't make this happen, or I'm things aren't working out like I'm used to because I'm not relying on that 10-year-old tertiary process anymore. And so then you stop and you go back to all your old habits, and then you start over again. You're like, I should really get into my Copilot again. You start up again, and then you get freaked out and you stop, and then you go back to your 10-year-old again. And that fits and starts takes forever. Now you're in construction zone perpetually. Whereas if I had to do it over again, I would have just been like, all right, I'm in my introverted feeling Copilot. Everybody else can go screw themselves. I'm not going into my 10-year-old right now. I'm just going to be here, and I'm going to get through this. Damn it. I'm going to make this happen. However I have to make it happen, it's going to happen, which unfortunately it's not a to-do item. It's kind of just being in resonance, right? So it's even worse. But the point is, get through it. Go after the thing you want to do. Otherwise, you kind of get stuck in this churn forever.
Yeah, well, and I think that's where the faith comes in too, the faith in yourself. Because, I mean, I'm talking about this time thing as a perceiver because that was sort of what kicked off the original question. But if I'm going to personalize it to me as an ENTP, not just like as a general perceiver, like my sacrifice is that people get mad at me a lot. Because I'm not kowtowing to that extroverted feeling or harmony 10-year-old as much. So I'm just not being as, I'm not being as diplomatic. I try to be diplomatic. But if my introverted thinking or accuracy function has something it has to say, then it says it. And it takes the hit of somebody else being upset. And so I get people mad at me a lot. Like I have people upset with me on a regular basis, and I have to go make peace with them. I've gotten to a place where making peace with another person is actually, I'm getting better at it all the time because I have to go do it so often, because I generate way more conflict than I ever did as in the past. In the past, I was way more of a people pleaser, so I didn't have to deal with as much conflict, and that was nice. But I also was not me. I was a shell of who I, actually was intended to be, and I outsourced all my thinking. And so then when I started really working on it, I was able to keep my thinking, I got to own that again, but then I also started to sort of systematically destroy relationships where people were used to me thinking like outsourcing my thoughts to them. And so because of that, what I had to have was a higher level of faith in myself that even though I'm causing conflict in these situations, or at least I'm not avoiding conflict and I'm allowing it to emerge, that I am a good enough person, that I have faith in myself as a well-intended and good, solid human being, that conflict is not a sign of the quality of human that I am. Like, I have to have faith in myself that I'm on the right path and that I'm getting better and more refined as I go. And that as I'm doing better with my Copilot of introverted thinking or accuracy, I can bring more and more components of that 10-year-old tertiary, not as a strategy to lean on, but as something to season my accuracy. And so as I'm delivering assertive truths, I'm doing it with more compassion. I'm doing it in a way where people like to receive the information more because they know it's coming from a place of like agape love, a love that I have for the other human being. And I'm still not great at that, but I'm getting better at it. And so I have to have faith that I'm like the conflict is not reflecting back to me that I'm a low quality person, that the conflict is reflecting back to me that I'm actually getting more into my Copilot, and that's actually a good sign. And that would be like the person walking by the construction zone and judging it. And that's going to happen sometimes. We're going to piss people off. We're going to make people upset with our development and growth. And at the end of all of it, like that judgment that you get from other people is not a sign that you're on the wrong path necessarily. Now, of course, you'll have to ensure that you're not just upsetting other people arbitrarily because you're sort of digging into your rut and going like, I have a right to piss you off with my growth. Like, we're not trying to say that other people being upset is necessarily a sign that you're on the right path, or that pissing other people off is like a symbol that you're doing great. It's that if other people are upset by your work in progress, if they are not used to this, and the feedback you're getting is that the growth itself is not good, then that's actually not, that's to be expected. That's actually to be expected. You're not trying to piss people off, but if it happens and it's based on you being more in your auxiliary development, then don't let that derail you. Trust that you get both at the end, again, right? You're persuaded that this is the right behavior path to do, that you get to be a higher quality person, and have faith that you will be a high quality person at the end of it. In fact, somebody that those people who are upset in the meantime can actually lean into better. You will be able to show up for them better. And that I've seen that in years of my relationship. Some of my development like kind of irritates you. And some of your development kind of irritates me. Like we get pissed off at each other while watching the other person grow, knowing they're on the right path, but still feeling frustrated because we're not getting the results we want in the moment. We've had to really trust that at the end of these personal development journeys that we're on, once we get to like a precipice and we've gone to like sort of the next level, that any antagonism we felt in the meantime because you weren't showing up exactly the way I wanted you to show up in the moment because you were working on this project. At the end of that, I have a higher quality human being to call as my partner. And so I have to trust the process. I have to sort of have faith that we're becoming better people, even if in the meantime, there's some conflicts that arise from these projects.
Yeah, and everybody's going to try to force you back into those strategies that worked. They're going to know that you're changing and shifting. And unconsciously, I mean, I don't think people are after you when you do this as a person, but they're definitely going to want you to be in the strategies that have worked up until now. You know, I think that's a key here is you're not just in a construction zone for yourself. Other people that are close to you are it's going to be difficult for them not to encourage you to go back into that 10-year-old process as you're developing your Copilot or whatever process you're stuck in. I mean, some people are stuck in like a grip of their 3-year-old. I mean, it's not all just the 10-year-old. Often that's where we find it in our work with people. But I think this is it's not going to be easy. I think that's the core message is this is not going to be easy. And the other thing I wanted to do maybe, Antonia, before we left, is just we've been talking about ourselves a lot as two ENPs. And I think there's a lot of richness there. But I'd like to speak to INJs, INTJs, and INFJs. That's a huge amount of people listening often. And then INPs often also listen, INTPs and INFPs. Those are some of our 4 biggest audiences. I'd like to maybe workshop how this might look for an INJ, for example, because really, you know, it's a little different for all of those types I just mentioned in that your Copilot is an extroverted process. So you're actually going to be getting out and doing something differently. For us, for Antonia and myself, it's a little bit, I think we have a little, I believe, again, I'm overvaluing my own experience. It's a little more challenging is that there's no to-do list for us. In fact, we have to abandon our to-do lists. Antonia has to abandon the extroverted thing of being on time, you know, extroverted feeling, harmony of interfacing with the world on a schedule that makes sense for the world. She has to let go of that and just sit with what makes sense for her. I have to let go of getting things accomplished in the outer world, using my emotions to do them, you know, maybe negative emotions to get those done. Well, that to-do list serves me well. You as an introvert, if you're an INJ or an INP, it is more about doing things in the outer world. So I think it's a little different for you how that might show up for those 4 types.
Well, I think what's nice, and you're right, intuitives comprise the biggest portion of our demographic. But I think what's nice is that actually we could speak to sensors too right now, because I think INJs and ISJs have very similar challenges.
Absolutely.
Since they're going to be developing the same Copilot functions as each other. You know, like INFJs and ISFJs will both be going to extroverted feeling or harmony as their Copilot. And ISTJs and INTJs will both be going to extroverted thinking or effectiveness. And the same thing with INPs and ISPs. They'll also be developing the same Copilots as well. ISFPs and INFPs will both be developing introverted feeling or authenticity. INPs will both be, it's a little different for the INPs. Back up. Both the INPs will be developing extroverted intuition or exploration, but I think the pattern still holds for ISPs that will be developing extroverted sensing for both ISTPs and ISFPs. So it's actually all the IPs and IIJs will be doing something similar. And the same thing with ESPs, like we've been talking about being 2 ENPs. ESPs will be developing the same functions as we will be. And then we talked about ENJs, and ESJs will also be developing a very similar style of function. They'll be developing introverted sensing or memory. And the reason why it's nice to kind of have your finger on the pulse of whatever you're developing is that the thing that will keep pulling you back to your 10-year-old or tertiary is whatever ego or conceit is keeping you there to begin with and overvaluing your strategy that lives there. I feel like our 10-year-old, and one of the reasons why it's so difficult for people to accept the limitation of their 10-year-old or tertiary function is because a lot of ego and conceit lives there. It's hard for us to acknowledge that we might have a limitation in something that we depend upon so strongly. For INJs and ISJs, The conceit that lives there is that they have to expose themselves to outside feedback to calibrate how well they're doing. If you're an INJ, you're living in a loop, or you're overvaluing or over-relying on your 10-year-old tertiary. That means you're going from either introverted intuition as an INJ, or let's talk about ISJs too, introverted sensing or memory. And then you're looping it, which is introverted. Both of these functions are introverted, right? They're both self-referencing, going inside the mind to try to figure out what's meaningful and what means something. And then they're attaching it to either introverted thinking or accuracy or introverted feeling or authenticity, depending on whether they're an IFJ or an ITJ. And when you go to that 10-year-old tertiary that's introverted feeling or introverted thinking, that means you get to subjectively determine your personal worth or value. You get to decide subjectively how well you're doing. But if you go into that Copilot of extroverted thinking, effectiveness, or extroverted feeling or harmony, now all of a sudden you have to get outside feedback on how well you're doing. That exposes you to a bunch of feedback that you might not want to hear. You might not want to believe. It means that you now no longer are the sole arbiter of your personal value or worth in terms of the impact you're making in the outside world. Meaning that, like in the concept of Simone de Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity, which says that the best ethical place is when you balance attention between sort of the subject and the object. You're the subject and anything in the outside world is the object. And you're trying to balance those two things and create a tension between them. As IJs, now you have to take in the objects or the opinions of the objects in the outside world, other people, and the impact you're having on the systems in the outside world. Now you have to take that in way more into account, and you don't get to just decide whether or not you're doing well, which is in some ways a relief, because unfortunately, when either introverted feeling or introverted thinking is your tertiary or 10-year-old function, you have a tendency to be a little perfectionistic. Like you demand more from yourself, which is the ego talking as well. Like you're an elevated human being that should be able to perform perfectly. That's a very egocentric concept or statement. So you get to determine your value or worth based on outside metrics, which oftentimes will kind of let you off the hook a little bit more. But it also means that you don't get to see yourself in an elevated way. Or conversely, you might actually feel like you're not a very good person that can't accomplish much at all. And then the outside world gives you a kick in the butt and says, no, you need to get out there and do more because you absolutely can accomplish and you're not doing nearly enough to meet your potential. That is a struggle, right? Your strategies that keep you home and safe and allowing yourself to, self-assess and not have to get outer world feedback. Sometimes that outer world feedback is very distressing. And so IJs will oftentimes believe that their introverted thinking or introverted feeling is much better than it is because they want to believe that they're accurately self-assessing. And the outside world will let you know whether or not you are. So that's the challenge. But when you get to that point, you do get to let go of perfectionism. Like you get to actually have impact in the outside world in a way that is not just your imagination. It's not just a self-assessment. And also because you're getting an accurate assessment from the outside world, you're getting accurate, calibrated feedback, then you can, instead of either diminishing what you're capable of or overblowing what you're capable of, you get real self-esteem because it's based on things that you can engage with, not just invent inside of yourself. And so that's the challenge for IJs. And at the same time, when you actually go to your Copilot, now the challenge will be that you will be clumsy. You will show up not doing as well as you imagined you might on the first go. You'll feel like you need more time to prep or prepare. But when you get out there and you're clumsy and you break some stuff and you don't do as well as you thought you did, and then you move up a little bit and you find yourself actually having kind of a knack for this and getting better, eventually you get to both make impact in the outside world and get good high quality self-esteem. So again, you get both. But in the meantime, it's going to feel like you're breaking a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, in the same vein, if you're an IP, ISFP, INFP, ISTP, or INTP in the Myers-Briggs system, you are going to have that 10-year-old process as a way to defend your rightness about things, that very subjective rightness that you have about the world, whether it's something that makes sense to you, if you're using introverted thinking or accuracy as your driver, or if something resonates with you for introverted feeling or authenticity as your driver, you're going to want to protect that. Protect that rightness, the subjective way you see the world. And your Copilot is going to either be, if you are an intuitive, it's going to be extroverted intuition is your growth state, or exploration, we've nicknamed it. If you're a sensor, you're an ISP, your growth position is going to be extroverted sensing or sensation. Both of these are going to require you to perceive the outer world more than just your inner state. So you're getting outside of yourself to perceive what's going on outside of you, which will challenge how right you are about things. You have to now challenge, wait, maybe I wasn't right about that all along. That subjective way of something making sense or resonating with me is now coming into question as you move from that 10-year-old process up into that Copilot of getting outside and perceiving the external world. So I think that's the challenge for the IPs that are doing this work. And that's where that ego threat can come from for them.
Yeah, well, and then the question comes, well, if I have to expose my, opinions to new patterns and new evidence, then if I really like being right all the time, what's the persuasive element for me to get out into the world and observe all these things that might be actually, directly defying what I once thought was true? Like, what if I have very strong convictions and a very strong core belief system, but I get into the outside world and all of this information and data is directly contradicting it? Now what do I do? And so for oftentimes for IPs, when they start to do serious work, right, serious Copilot work, it's usually a lot of crises of conscience or crises of faith, right? Faith in themselves. How could I have hitched my wagon to something that was so wrong? Do I know anything? Right? Like, and if I can't,
how could I have been so wrong?
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's very personal. Like, I was wrong here.
Yeah. And I thought for sure I saw this bigger picture, or I thought for sure that I had consulted the experts, or I thought for sure my information was good. And now I get into the outside world and the outside world is giving me all this like contradictory information. So do I even have the ability to know myself? Do I even have the ability to know what's meaningful for me? And so again, the persuasive component of getting into your Copilot is actually the fear is not being able to have a comfort zone anymore. By the way, that going to that 10-year-old is the comfort zone of being able to invent any reality you want, and or to just stay in a place that's comfortable to you, where you don't have to get that outside feedback that directly contradicts what you might feel is really important. But what's nice is that when you do true Copilot development, you get both. You get both the information that helps you refine your opinions and thoughts and convictions so that you are much closer to being your true accurate self, or true authentic self. Your convictions are now actually not just things that are maybe latent or had been outsourced to somebody else that you trusted or whatever. You actually get to come up with all sorts of new imaginative ideas that could potentially bust through what everybody else sees as reality. Like, you might, instead of finding a comfort zone or projecting an unreality on the world, you might actually be in a discovery process of figuring out nuances to reality. And then because of that, you actually get comfortable with things like feeling indecisive sometimes, or not having all the answers. Because the challenge with IPs is that they double down on that 10-year-old because it makes them feel certain. And so if they don't feel a sense of certainty, then they feel very uncomfortable. So they go to a comfort zone of certainty regardless of whether or not they're right. But if you actually do Copilot development, you get to sort of ensure that your convictions are much closer aligned with things that truly make sense to you, and you get more comfortable with the feeling of uncertainty. And when you feel comfortable with the feeling of uncertainty, it means you can be comfortable almost anywhere. And so you actually get both again. You get better, high quality convictions, and you get an extended comfort zone. So you get to keep your comfort as well. But in the meantime, it can look like an existential crisis, which, from both the inside and outside views can look like a complete and total cluster.
Yeah. And if you're an EJ, so ESFJ, ENFJ, ESTJ, or ENTJ in the Myers-Briggs system, your Copilot getting in there is going to be an introverted perceiving process. So for the intuitives, it's going to be introverted intuition. We've nicknamed it perspectives. For sensors, it's going to be introverted sensing, or what we've nicknamed memory. Now, you as an EJ have relied upon your 10-year-old process of either sensation, if you're an intuitive, or exploration, if you're a sensor, for speed, to manage your world, to get things accomplished, or to meet the needs in the outer world. you've really relied upon that 10-year-old process for the speed it brings you, speed of connections, speed of being able to operate and pivot at a moment's notice, being present to the moment, to what's going on here and now, or to think outside the box when you need to pull upon that. This is where you've really anchored in probably some pride and some ego around being able to accomplish things or meet needs quickly. And if you slow down to get into that Copilot, because introverted sensing and introverted intuition are very slow over time processes. They take a while to percolate. They're like a simmering pot of stew on the stove all afternoon, if you will. And it takes some time to get the learning or the perception from those. So it's going to feel like your life is grinding to a halt if you stop every time and reflect upon the deeper perception of what's happening. If you allow your memory process of introverted sensing, if you're a sensor, and you sit there and you ruminate over past events and the meaning of things that have happened to you over time and precedent that's being set, that takes a while to do. Or if you're using introverted intuition, you're intuitive, and you're using that perspectives process, it's going to take a while for your unconscious to bubble up some of the insights you're going to get from just sitting and perceiving something over a period of time. So that slowness is going to be so frustrating for you as an EJ. You're going to want to just abandon that and run back to that 10-year-old so you can connect the speed back up to yourself and get things done again and meet needs much more quickly.
Yeah, when I think what happens to ESJs is that they feel like they're losing their gut instinct, right? Like your gut instinct, that is that sort of 10-year-old tertiary of intuition. They feel like, well, if I'm not that good at seeing what's coming down the pike, if I'm not that great at like my gut and projecting onto the world these patterns, then did I just sort of lose my gut instinct? Do I have to review everything? And if I start reviewing everything, then I'm realizing that maybe some of the patterns I made, some of these instincts or intuitions were actually wrong. So do I lose my those killer instincts, right? Or like, do I lose my ability to sort of see what happens? And again, the persuasion is that you get both, which is that you probably have been creating sort of low quality patterns. The more you do introverted sensing or memory work in that Copilot, the more you're actually going to be able to review things to pick up patterns in retrospect. And the quality of your patterns becomes higher. And at the same time, you get to sort of understand yourself in all of this better. You get to understand personal meaning. You're not just in action. You're not just industrious. You're actually, you're not just go and making things happen. You actually get some time for yourself to determine what means something to you. And you get some like sort of self-care time, some self-awareness, some introspection time, and your patterns become higher quality. But in the meantime, you're going to look far less industrious. It's going to look like you're sort of backing off the pedal. For ENJs, again, you lose some of that industriousness. You lose some of that quick, sort of engagement. But like our friend, he also felt like he was losing his ability to read people using that extroverted sensing or sensation 10-year-old. So he's like, am I not as good at reading people as I thought? I thought I was really good at reading situations. But once you get into the Perspectives Copilot, again, you get both because they're not false reads. You're not just reading what you want from the situation to support your ends. You're actually getting inside the mind of the other person or seeing a meta perspective to determine that the reads you're getting are actually much closer to what's happening for the other individual. And so when you take action, you're taking much higher quality action. So it's not going to be as fast, but it's going to make sure that when you're doing it, it's the right action to take. So it's actually far more, again, effective than it is just getting into action and go. And we've talked about ENPs with Joel and I think ESPs are very similar. They're going to deal with that same concept of, having to sacrifice that 10-year-old of extroverted feeling harmony or extroverted thinking effectiveness to get into that more subjective introverted feeling and introverted thinking. So we're actually covering territory that we've mentioned multiple times in different podcasts. We're covering territory that talks about the advantages to developing your Copilot, which we've did a whole series on. We're talking about it in basically kind of the terms of the firm model, which is what you feel like you're losing when you start growing and developing yourself. You're going to not be able to lean in on that fixation as much. Depending upon where you fall in the firm model, it's going to have to expose you to different things that will challenge your strategies and challenge your fixations. But I think the point of this is not to just, I feel like we've covered this territory better in other podcasts. We just wanted to make sure that we had sort of that piece of what you're actually looking at when you develop your Copilot and also what's at stake and why you need to be persuaded. Like, what is it about actually developing your Copilot that is going to be worth the ROI? And what does it look like when you get both? What does it look like when you get both the thing that you might not have been able to develop based on your native wiring, and also at the same time get the thing that your sort of slapdash strategy of your 10-year-old or tertiary is giving you? What does it look like when you get both? And I think that's the important piece, so that once you're persuaded to do it, and once you have faith that the person on the other side is going to be a much higher quality version of yourself, then, as Joel mentioned, this is a timeline question. When do you start this action? When do you start going down this road? And I would agree with Joel. I think there's no time like the present. I mean, unless you're going through like a time period of true trauma.
Sure.
And you're healing from trauma, like you've like maybe been in a car accident recently, or you've discovered something horrific from your past that you need to be getting through. I mean, focus on healing work if that's something that's in front of you right now. But the sooner you can start developing your Copilot and the faster you can hit it, the sooner you're through all of this. I mean, I always appreciate road work that is quick, right? Like road work that takes a year versus road work that takes a couple months. There's no question of which one is the optimal scenario. So unless you're going through things that are extremely labor intensive in other ways, like healing work, if you have any space in your life at all, I agree with you, Joel. I would have hit my Copilot development much earlier, because I feel like the rewards are, I mean, they're almost indescribable.
And the benefit of this too is I wouldn't say there's an end to any of this, but you could say there's a plateau you hit, or like the next level of feeling of accomplishment. Like you feel proficient enough to where, okay, I'll continue working on myself, but the big construction project is done. I feel like these things are connected. At the end of that, I believe, or at that mile marker, I should say, I believe you're going to feel more like yourself. Ultimately, that's what we're after, is the sense of, who am I really? What is going on for me really? And you're going to pull on something that's your strength, which is that Copilot. Ultimately, I believe, from my personal experience, the people we've worked with here at Personality Hacker, that's a great place to come from. It's empowering for most people I talk to. They love being there once they've got it connected up and the construction, quote unquote, construction project is finished. They feel really freaking good, and they're glad they went through it. In the process, it's horrible and torturous sometimes. You might have insights or flashes of really cool stuff happening, but it can be grueling work to do this. And when it's done, or when the next marker is hit, I think you'll look back over that work and go, why didn't I do this sooner? Why didn't I just get on this and plow through the hard work that it was and make these changes in my life, because I'm so happy now that I've actually done these things. So I think these are some ideas that we have for you as you're on your personal journey with us. We're doing this together, right, as a community. And I think these are some thoughts that we have toward you that you might take and use in your personal growth journey, as far as that, some of the trappings that come from this work, some of the tension points, the nervousnesses, the resistances that you might have in doing the work. I think these can definitely speak to that. And we'd love to hear from you. If you have comments about what we've been talking about here on this podcast, some insight, maybe some work you've done on your end, and you've got a story to share, some insight, a question to ask, come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this podcast. Leave a comment, ask a question, share your story. It's important that we hear from you, and you're part of this community, and we're all talking together and sharing these ideas. So it's your turn to come over and say something now.
Mm-hmm. Do you think people can tell I've been hopped up this entire podcast?
You've been hopped up on caffeine?
I had an Optimind, which we always talk about not being a sponsor because we just like Optimind a lot. I had an Optimind, and then I had like 3 cups of coffee.
You can't mention them unless they're going to send us a check.
I know. Optimind, send us money. We keep mentioning you on our podcast and in our programs. No, and I'm like, I think I've been listening to our podcast over the last few months, and I've noticed that I've gotten more chill. Like my vibe is generally more chill in the podcast. But then when we were doing any edit points or listening back, I could hear like my energy was super hopped up, and I'm like, this sounds like I used to be. But yeah, I'm wondering if it's super obvious that I'm just like I'm caffeine jittery. What do you think? Do you think it's obvious?
It might be. I don't know.
You should come by and let me know. Does it sound like I'm jittery? I don't know.
I think you sounded pretty present. I mean, I can feel your energy from here, and I can tell you're a little bit wired up, I guess.
Yeah, like my hand is shaking. I should probably close up shop and go for a run.
We're also in the middle of a lot of projects too. So this is one of the things we're doing.
Yeah.
So and again, to speak to what we're talking about today, I'm trying to let go of all the emotions and all the anchor points around the stuff we've got to do after this, right? And just be present to the moment. And as you started talking, all those emotions started wearing, oh gosh, maybe I should be hopped up too. Maybe I should be anxious as well. Like all that old stuff came in. I'm like, wait a second. No, let's be present here. Let's get through this. Let's do this the right way. Let's finish strong.
Which is awesome because normally if I'm jittery, you're jittery, but you have been so chill this whole podcast. You've been so cool. And I've been like shaking like a little chihuahua. I've just been like, okay, let's get to the next thing. So anyway, like, I don't know. I'm not sure if you can tell, but I guess it doesn't really matter. I think I just had my introverted thinking or accuracy just had to acknowledge the fact that I'm hopped up right now. Anyway, if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you'd like to leave us a rating or review on iTunes, that helps us out. And of course, our book is out. So if you'd like to purchase a copy on Amazon, Books A Million, Barnes & Noble, or your local bookstore, which is our preference, please do so. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon about how you liked our book, that would help us out a lot too.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you next time on the Personality Hacker Podcast.